Hello, everybody. Welcome to the beginning of the next panel. It's good to have you back. I'm just going to invite up Marina Durano, who will be chairing the next session, and Sarah Veale, who will be speaking. Bear with me. I think I've invited everybody up if you want to make sure that your cameras and things are on. Yes, perfect. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Hi, Marina. Okay.
Hello.
Leave the keynote in your capable hands. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah, and good day, everyone. Welcome back to the Four Nations Conference, and welcome to our session. My name is Marina Durano. I am a Senior Program Officer at the Women's Rights Program of the Open Society Foundations. We are very proud to have had a partnership with the Women's Budget Group since 2016. And when Dr. Marianne Stephenson broached the possibility of expanding the work to cover the Four Nations, it was an easy decision to make. There's a very solid foundation to build upon and plenty of commitment horizons. We've had some very inspiring stories about gender-responsive budgeting across the Four Nations. We heard this morning, or this morning in my case, early afternoon for you. And it's now time to learn about what we can achieve when we focus our combined energies on a collective undertaking. So before I introduce our speaker for this session, I'd like to remind everyone of the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can post questions or comments, and your questions can be upvoted so that we can prioritize those questions that are of interest to many people. So now I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce our speaker for this session, Sarah Veale. Sarah is currently a non-executive director of the United Kingdom Accreditation Service and chair of the national charity Equally Ours. Sarah has workers organizing. She was head of the Equality and Employment Rights Department at the Trades Union Congress, where she worked for 30 years before her retirement in 2015. During her time at the TUC, Sarah was a member of the Advisory, Conciliation, and Arbitration Service Council and the Health and Safety Executive Board. Sarah was a member of the TUC team which negotiated the agreement with the Confederation of British Industry and the government that formed the basis of the Temporary Agency Work Directive. She was also responsible for the development of TUC policy on employment law. Until January 2017, Sarah was a board member at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And until 2018, she was a member of the Regulatory Policy Committee, which provides independent assessments of government regulatory and deregulatory rules. From July 2018 to April 2019, Sarah was a member of the Fair Work Commission, which produced a report with recommendations to the Wales government. Most recently, from 2019 until last year, Sarah was a commissioner of the UK Women's Budget Group, Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. Sarah was awarded the CBE in 2006 for services to diversity. In 2012, Sarah received an honorary doctorate in laws from the Oxford Brookes University. Presenting today best practice in Four Nations collaboration, let's give a warm welcome to Sarah Veale.
Thank you very much indeed, Marina. Normally when I do these sort of presentations, I say it's wonderful to see you all. Of course, I can't see you all, so I'll just have to imagine you all. I can see you, Marina, though, and it's very nice and comforting to be able to see your lovely, friendly face. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And in some ways, I reflected earlier on today about how very much we do still need to get to having a gender equal economy and a gender equal society. We're not there yet by a long, long chalk, but seeing you all this afternoon and listening to the wonderful presentations that we've heard already, I already feel inspired and I feel confident. There are so many of us out there who want to aim and then achieve what we've been pushing for, in some cases, in my case, certainly for rather a long time. And things have improved enormously. I was also looking back, and I remember in my early days at the Trades Union Congress, which in those days was not exactly a bastion of gender equality, to say the very least. And I remember one of my heroines, one of my absolute people I really aspired to be like, was someone called Margaret Prosser, who some of you might know. She's now Baroness Prosser, has been in the House of Lords for quite some time. But she was Deputy General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, and she became president of the TUC for a year. And she was I think only the third woman ever to have done it. And she was certainly the first woman that I ever had the privilege and the pleasure to work with. And I remember Margaret's very first act at the first executive committee of the TUC that she chaired. She said, right, she said, I want to make it absolutely clear that football is banned. And you might think that's a bit cruel. People love football. But of course, what was happening at those meetings was for the first 10 minutes or quarter of an hour, you would have this, I think, almost entirely male banter about the football results of the weekend before. And these were loud and cheerful and all the rest of it. And we're an absolutely classic example, of course, of male bonding. And there we are. But the problem was that for the small number of women there who'd come along expecting and prepared to discuss all the important items on the agenda, they then had to spend 10 minutes waiting for all this to pass on so that they could get on with what they'd come in to do. And it was actually quite an alienating process. And I was remembering this morning how, as a woman, you do feel excluded. If the whole atmosphere and the relaxed bit of the atmosphere is all about a male-dominated activity, you feel excluded. And things changed enormously at the TUC, but I thought, well done, Margaret, and she stuck to that. And the boys absolutely never dared talk about football at that meeting again. They could go outside and huddle in the corridor and talk about football to their heart's content, but not instead of agenda items or in a way that held the meeting up. And the other thing I remember, just a reflection again on the unspoken things, the things that we don't necessarily talk about at conferences, but the cultural background, the kind of context in which a lot of us have to operate or used to have to operate. I also remember there weren't very many women working in policy jobs at the TUC, and I had to go around what were called the industry committees, many of which were extremely male dominated, and give presentations on policy. My particular expertise at that time was on further education and skills, which is still a hugely important area. And I went in to do my session at the Printing Industries Committee, which was 100% male, and a certain sort of type of male as well. I'm afraid a dying breed now, sadly, in some ways. But I remember I did my presentation, and you stayed behind after your presentation to join in with the discussion and hopefully to inform the discussion and answer questions. And there was this terrible silence after I'd done my presentation. And then the man chairing it whispered to my boss, who was looking after the organisation of the committee. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could hear my boss saying, "Oh no, don't worry, she won't mind at all," which filled me slightly with trepidation. But I ploughed on, and it was only after the meeting that I asked my boss what the problem had been, and he said, well, the chair was very unhappy about having you in the room because he said that nobody would be allowed to swear. I thought, oh my goodness me, they can't conduct their meetings without vast amounts of swearing, which is a sort of very male thing in those days, a way of showing off, and often, I have to say, sexist and in many ways quite offensive. But those were the sort of conditions under which we worked then. And so now I look at the TUC, just as an example, led by a wonderful woman, First General Secretary Frances O'Grady, and I see lots of brilliant trade union women leading the way. Unison's just elected its first woman General Secretary, and I feel uplifted. And coming here today, I feel uplifted all over again. And I felt uplifted while I was doing all the work we did on the commission, which I thoroughly enjoyed and which I think was an enormously productive and fruitful experience. And I just wanted to say, listening this morning to the presentations, in a way, half my job now has been done for me because they were all absolutely superb, and it was so good to hear in more detail, again, all the fantastic things that are going on in our four nations. I mean, really, really encouraging activities. So I'm going to get into the sort of main part of my speech now, you'll be pleased to know, after warming myself up a bit at your expense. I just want to apologise for looking down quite a bit. I know it's really weird. In a conference hall even, you tend to look down at notes if you're not very clever and you haven't memorised the whole thing. And I haven't memorised the whole thing. So it's a little bit rude, but I will be looking down some of the time instead of at my camera. So please forgive me for that. But when we get to questions at the end, I hope to be able to engage in a bit more of a friendly way with you all. I'm going to start by describing what the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which I'm going to call the Commission from now on as a convenient shorthand, was set up to do, and how it worked, and why we recommend a four nations approach to rectify the failures that we identified in the way in which the economy in the UK is currently structured. But I do recommend that you read the Commission's report. There's no substitute for actually reading it. It's very accessible. It's an absolutely smashing read, and it's got a very good summary, so you can weave your way in and out of the bits that might particularly interest you. So the Commission was established by the Women's Budget Group in the spring of 2019 with the objective of developing a vision of and a roadmap towards a new economy based on gender equality, care, well-being and sustainability. We travelled across the four nations of the UK, gathering evidence, holding consultation sessions with local women's and equalities organisations, with researchers and policy experts, and engaging with politicians and civil servants in each nation on what a future economy should and could look like, a gender equal economy. And we found there to be both commonalities and significant divergence across the four nations. Now, we did, of course, understand that the context of the UK is changing, and indeed will continue to change. But our proposals are relevant to all four nations of the UK. They are contingent on political will, and as you heard, I think from Diane a bit earlier, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of political will around the UK government, but we'll skip over that for now. And they're intended to be operational at the appropriate level of governance. We were aware, of course, of the tendency to conflate England with the UK. We were aware as well of the regional variations within England, which is, of course, hugely more populous than the other three nations that make up the UK. We were aware of the increasingly urgent debates taking place about the future of the UK and the possibilities of independence in some of those nations. The commissioners came from a wide range of backgrounds, including charities and non-governmental organisations, business, unions, and of course from each nation. In my own long experience at the TUC, it was often the case that ideas and initiatives that had developed in the different nations could in fact have worked very well across the whole of the UK. In the TUC, we also had a long established practice of collaboration across the equality structures in each nation. On some issues, policies and practices particularly suited the individual nation or region. For example, there was a yearly two-day meeting of the four nations TUC or equivalent women's committees. We included the Republic of Ireland as some of our unions recruited across the British Isles. The meeting would be hosted in turn by each national committee in whichever town or city they chose. We'd reach out to the different community groups and organisations in each location to learn more about local experiences and initiatives. It worked very well, so I was particularly pleased that the Commission adopted that sort of approach. I also had direct experience of working in one of the four nations other than England. As Marina said, I was a member of the Commission on Fair Work, which was set up by the Wales government in 2018 to look at how to improve working practices and employment relations in Wales. But other than that, I am based in England, although I'm, just as a side note, I wasn't particularly pleased to be able to go to Wales a lot, not only because I love Wales, but because my daughter has settled very happily in Cardiff, so I had a fantastic excuse to see more of her than I normally get to see. So it was a very pleasurable experience indeed. Similarly, other organisations I worked for, ACAS, the Health and Safety Executive, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, all had discrete operational head offices in the four nations, and I spent time in all of those too. So I don't need to be convinced that working across the four nations, respecting national traditions and structures, and learning from one another is best and potentially leads to a much better outcome for the UK as a whole. We were, of course, also very conscious of the likely impact of Brexit, both on the UK as a whole and also on the individual nations. COVID sadly hit us partway through our work, but fortunately, in the context of my topic today, not before we had had the opportunity to meet in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We were aware as we drew our conclusions and made our recommendations that the impact of COVID on the economy was going to be massive. We factored that in as far as we could, but it clearly is an ongoing situation. We believe, though, that our recommendations hold good for the economy as it recovers from COVID. Before starting our work, we made a public call for evidence on gender inequality and received a lot of very important information. What did we conclude were the current problems with the economy? Well, in a nutshell, entrenched inequality on gender, but also on race, ethnicity, disability, age, and sexuality. There were, of course, many intersectional issues too, as people live with more than one characteristic. Neglect of well-being of the planet and the people and creatures living on it was another huge problem. An overwhelming focus on short-term financial interests instead of long-term investment was the other. I'm going to look at our recommendations at the end of my talk, but for now I'm going to share with you some of the good examples of gender equality projects that we met and learned about in each of the nations. It's worth just noting that most decision-making, for example, on public services, has been devolved, and as a result of that, there has been substantial divergence across the four nations regarding the funding and provision of public services. It's worth also noting that local authorities also play a key role in the provision of public services, but of course have suffered calamitous cuts to their funding in recent years. Social care is devolved. So in Scotland, personal care, that's help with washing and dressing or preparing meals, but not housework, laundry or shopping, is available free of charge to over 65s and all adults with disabilities or degenerative conditions, regardless of income and personal assets. Differently, in England and Northern Ireland, only those with assets of less than £23,250 a year receive support from the state to meet their costs, except for the over 75s with acute needs in Northern Ireland, who are entitled to free personal care. In Wales, this asset limit is £24,000, but the cost of home care that an individual pays is capped at £90 a week. Pay for care workers is also subject to decisions at national and local level, although the national minimum wage is a UK law. Care workers in Scotland and Northern Ireland received a pay increase last year, I'm delighted to say, although the latter only brought Northern Ireland to parity with England, which still pays a rate below the real living wage. In Scotland last year, pay was increased to meet the real living wage. In Wales, some progress has been made towards eliminating the use of zero-hours contracts for domiciliary care workers, as employers are now obliged to offer care workers the option of guaranteed hours after 3 months of employment. So you can see in terms of social care, there's a variety of different practices, limits of public spending and personal allowances and so on. So quite a different and mixed picture. And our report goes into more detail about how those work. And I think you can see actually where systems are much kinder and more supportive to people with care needs in some nations than they are in others. Healthcare is also a devolved competency, and health systems and provision vary very significantly across the four nations. Investment in the National Health Service varies too. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's been squeezed heavily since 2010, although it has started to increase in Wales and Northern Ireland since 2017. Successive Scottish governments have increased and protected NHS spending, albeit within an overall reduced budget. And then moving on to something that very much excited me, which is that Scotland and Wales are both part of the group of wellbeing economy governments. Now, this group, which has been around since 2019, has begun to take steps towards integrating well-being into their approach to economic policy. There are other countries involved, which include New Zealand and Iceland. Now, 3 of those countries, of course, are led by women. I'm just saying, but it's an important thing, I think, to note. The objectives of the group are to collaborate in pursuit of innovative policy approaches, to create well-being economies, to progress towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and to address current economic, social, and environmental challenges. Each of the governments in the group has developed monitoring frameworks to measure well-being. Scotland has a national performance framework, Wales has national wellbeing indicators and has passed a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which provides a legislative framework requiring all public bodies to consider the impact of their decisions on people's well-being and to safeguard future generations. The Act encompasses social, economic and cultural well-being and sustainability. So the lessons emerging from the experiences of these countries suggest that while a well-being approach may be supportive of a gender equal economy, the two concepts are not synonymous. In a caring economy, gender equality would be mainstreamed into the well-being agenda to make sure that policies did not inadvertently reinforce gender stereotypes, discrimination or inequality, such as relying on women to prioritise the well-being of others at the expense of their own well-being. There's no reason why this approach could not also apply to England if the UK government wanted it to, and no doubt Northern Ireland too. A caring economy across the UK would take account that the UK comprises 4 nations and would learn from each about their experiences and divergent approaches. It does have to be noted that there is growing regional equality in the UK, with Camden and the City of London, the richest part of the UK, being 30% richer than the poorest, which is Ards and North Down in Northern Ireland. So huge regional and national discrepancies in terms of wealth inequality. Now, the Scottish Government has introduced statutory child poverty targets, which we did have a while back in the UK. Gordon Brown introduced them under that Labour government, but they were dispensed with following the election of the coalition government in 2010, sadly. So we now have child poverty targets, as I'm saying, back in Scotland, so that by 2030, less than 10% of children in Scottish households will be living in relative poverty. The national wellbeing indicators in Wales measure child poverty, but in the latest report, there had been a small increase, sadly, in child poverty rates. Increases in life expectancy have stalled in England for the first time in more than 100 years, with similar patterns in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In England, on average, women's life expectancy declined in the most deprived 10% of neighbourhoods between 2010 and 12 and 2016 and 18, and there were only negligible increases in male life expectancy in these areas. This decline in women's life expectancy took place in every region except for London, the West Midlands and the northwest of England. Looking at employment, we found a range of worker-owned companies, cooperatives and social enterprises that are concerned with the well-being of their employees, their subcontractors and the communities in which they operate. For example, Infinity Foods, which is a worker-owned whole foods cooperative, was very active in its community in Brighton, donating money to local wildlife charities and projects, supporting anti-poverty initiatives and homeless charities, and also supporting environmental campaigns. The Bristol Women's Commission is made up of women from key agencies across the city and includes 6 task groups made up of women with specific expertise or interest. The purpose of this commission is to work as a partnership to identify the key issues for women in Bristol and to produce an agreed women's strategy for the city with a specific, time-limited and practical action plan for its delivery. The public sector equality duty is a duty on public authorities in England, Wales and Scotland to consider how their policies or decisions affect people who are protected under the Equality Act 2010. As well as this general duty, there are Scottish-specific duties and Welsh-specific duties. The Equality Act also includes a socio-economic duty which, had it been implemented, would have required public bodies to adopt transparent and effective measures to address the inequalities that result from differences in occupation, education and place of residence or social class. Sadly, successive UK governments have refused to commence this part of the Act, which received royal assent at the end of the most recent period of Labour government, 2010. So in my opinion, it's pretty inexcusable that we're now in 2021 and this very important duty hasn't been enacted. It's just sitting idly on the statute book. However, It is in force in Scotland, and it's scheduled to enter force into Wales shortly if it hasn't already been. In Northern Ireland, Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998 introduced a statutory equality duty on designated public authorities. Intended as a transformative instrument, Section 75 is a legal duty of mainstreaming to ensure that equality of opportunity and good relations are central to public policy. This includes good relations between persons of different religious belief, political opinion, or racial group. Across all the nations, resources for survivors of domestic violence have been increasingly underfunded, despite a continuing rise in incidences, particularly tragically during the last year of the COVID epidemic. Very worrying indeed. The UK has a deregulated system for buses. Other than in Northern Ireland, bus services are primarily delivered by private companies. Governments at various levels have provided subsidies for retired people and sometimes other categories, and there are also subsidies for what are called socially necessary services in some places. Sadly, recent cuts in funding for local authorities have led to reductions in transport subsidies at local level and reductions in services. The exceptions are London, the east of England and the south east, where bus mileage has actually been increasing over the past decade. The voluntary Welsh bus quality standard aims to help bus operators and local authorities in Wales to improve the quality of bus services. Core requirements for this standard include drivers undertaking disability and equalities awareness training, which must be refreshed every 5 years. This standard also has an enhanced element where providers have to include a ticketing scheme aimed at people employed on part-time or irregular hours. So you can see that buses are incredibly important for women who go out to do paid work, but also for women to go out, do shopping, get to childcare centres, and so on and so forth. So cuts in bus provision or expensive bus fares have a hugely disproportionate effect on women. And that's why I've always been very, very interested personally in public transport and buses and accessibility and so on, because I kind of feel it's like housing and food. I think it should be a human right that you're able to travel around, particularly for reasons related to employment, but also caring responsibilities and so on. And of course, education systems across the UK have evolved. Cuts in adult education have been made since 2010 in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The exception has been Scotland, where funding was increased in 2020 by 3.6%, which was over inflation. Adult education, of course, is crucial in providing opportunities for adults to refresh their skills or to learn new skills or to make up for falling back during their compulsory education. And it can be hugely important for women who've been out of the labour market while bringing up children or who have missed out on in-work training, which sadly is too often the case. And the social security system is another nationally determined system, but with some flexibility in delivery provided. This gives national governments and local authorities the ability to improve delivery and procedures and, if they have the funds, to provide additional benefits. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, for example, some of the worst aspects of universal credit have been mitigated, including frequency of payment and arranging split payments. In addition, the Scottish Government has introduced the Scottish Child Payment and has also substantially increased carers allowance. Some elements of income tax have also been devolved to Scotland and more recently to Wales. Income tax on earnings is now slightly more progressive in Scotland than it is in the other nations. Council tax is, as the name implies, a locally generated tax, but with nationally imposed limitations on how much is levied. And I think, as Diane again mentioned a bit earlier on, Diane Elson, it's generally agreed across the political spectrum now that council tax is in dire need of reform. It's regressive and now only bears the loosest relation to the value of people's properties. Neither does it raise sufficient funding to meet local services needs. Okay, I'm now going to draw towards a conclusion by talking about the Commission's overall conclusions and our recommendations on what needs to be done to achieve a gender equal economy. Firstly, we need to reimagine what we mean by the economy, so that centrality of care to the economy is recognised. This means that the contribution of unpaid as well as paid work is valued. It means that time is seen as important as well as money, well-being as well as output, and ecological limits, as well as innovations. It means that the impact of all economic policies on equalities is properly assessed and bold action is taken to mitigate any negative impacts. Next, to invest in social and physical infrastructure so that public services address diverse needs on an equal basis and allow people to flourish in a way that protects and values the planet. And somebody mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, so I'm stealing this one as well because it's a good point, that some of the big infrastructure projects that are being funneled to what the Conservatives are calling the red wall areas, who I think, I don't know if it was Diane again, I keep quoting you, Diane, but it might not have been, the sort of pork barrel politics we now see, where money is shelled out to communities that are thought to be likely to vote Conservative in the future. And that's not putting too fine a point on it, but it's true. The sorts of jobs that will be created by additional railway building and so on, necessary though additional railways might be, are going probably to be largely male jobs and not jobs for women. And that's very important to bear in mind, as is the fact that because the way the economy's been run down and the lack of training for men actually, as well as women, it's going to be difficult to find sufficient numbers of skilled men to do a lot of that work. So we're going to have to go outside again and bring labour into the country. So talk about one of the most self-defeating exercises. This really is one that needs to be called out, I think. But what we're talking about is providing for a free at point of use universal care service financed through the public purse, closely connected to the NHS. And of course that will create a lot of new jobs, and it would also create a lot of much better paid jobs, one would hope. But it should also include free, the gender equal economy would also include free universal childcare provision and specialist violence against women and girls support providers, adequately funded. Local authorities should be funded to build sufficient energy efficient social housing and genuinely affordable housing. There should be increased investment in a high quality green public transport system and a well-funded caring education system that prioritises well-being and challenges gender stereotypes. The worlds of paid and unpaid work have to be transformed to provide not just more jobs, but better jobs. These jobs would enable men and women to share paid and unpaid work equally. They would provide a secure and living income, be environmentally sustainable, and be free from gender stereotypes and discrimination. Much investment is needed in a caring social security system, which is based on dignity and autonomy, and which helps to ensure that people fulfil their capabilities and live a meaningful life in and out of employment, and regardless of migration status throughout their lives. The tax systems across the UK need to be transformed to make them more progressive and fair, and to generate more revenue to invest in social security and social and physical infrastructure. The taxation of wealth and income from wealth needs to be overhauled so that unearned income, of which there's a great deal in this country, concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people, is taxed at the same rate as earned income. And as I said, council tax has to be reformed. The overall fiscal and monetary policy framework must be refocused on building a caring economy. There should not be restrictive targets for government borrowing. Targets and indicators should be directly related to well-being, gender equality and sustainability. We need a trade system that's socially and environmentally sustainable. All post-Brexit trade and investment agreements should guarantee no deterioration of environmental, human rights and labour standards in the UK and in our trading partners. Trade deals must be assessed for their impact on equality and human rights, and public services have to be excluded. And it can be done. The recent trade deal with New Zealand includes specific provisions on gender equality. And finally, the international economic system needs to be transformed so that it's supportive of the creation of caring economies across the world, because we don't live in a bubble. An intergovernmental UN tax body is needed, with equal participation from all countries to break the deadlock in efforts to eliminate global tax evasion and avoidance. The debt crisis in developing countries should be addressed by supporting the basic principles for a sovereign debt restructuring process as agreed in 2015. All UK overseas development assistance should support the achievement of gender equality, well-being and sustainability in recipient countries. Now, that was an incredibly quick canter through what's a very complex topic. And again, I really do urge you to read our report, which fleshes out the skeleton that I've dangled in front of you, and will really give you much more information about the basic areas I've been talking about. So thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing and seeing possibly the reactions from you all. But thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Indeed, a lot to learn from the process that the Commission for a Gender Equal Economy had gone through. And if I may also highlight, which you didn't really speak to, is that one of the important lessons is actually the entire process of listening, of going to the communities, what the Commission had done, and to hear and the stories, and not just of the issues they are facing, but how they are trying to solve those issues that you have very clearly organized in ways that is useful, not just for the across the 4 nations, but for the rest of the world, and the rest of those of us who dream of the same vision of a gender equal economy. Thank you so much for sharing the highlights of that work. So I'm going to look now to the chat. I'm not sure that there are any questions that were posted. So I would then encourage people to just signal somehow to me, if and then we can bring you on to the stage so that you can ask your question live. Please do. And I'm going to ask also the organizers to help me identify who these people are. We have posted on the chat box the link to the report of the Commission. So you can always look at the details there, look for the details there. And I don't know if there's anything from the audience right now. It was a lot, but all very interesting. So meanwhile, maybe what I can do is also share how important, Sarah, what you've said resonates with me as far as the work in Latin America is concerned. You know, the differences in across the nations that you had described is also something that the Argentinian government is facing at this moment, where the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments is also a little bit tricky in kind of similar ways that the way that you described. And so there is a drafting commission at the moment to write a bill to establish a federal integrated system of care, you know, in some ways addressing the different elements of care that you've also outlined in your presentation. And they're realizing that the inequalities, shall we say, or the differences in power between the federal and the provincial states are somewhat solidified by the Constitution itself. So they're unpacking the Constitution to unpack themselves the devolution and the decentralization of powers, including of financing, so that they can understand how a federal system for care could actually be financed as much as, you know, organized. Just checking, we have now a couple of questions here. Let me start with one for you, Sarah. What are the key elements of the approach of the Commission that you think can be transferred or actioned upon in other contexts?
I think, to me, it's a question of observing, meeting people, and just going out there and looking at what's working and how it's working. I don't think there's any substitute for going somewhere and spending some time with a group who are dedicated to and very experienced in achieving a particular end. So whether it's campaigning for better bus services somewhere, or setting up a women's refuge, whatever it is, go and find out how they've done it, what the obstacles might have been, what their aims and objectives were, how it's working. You can just learn and learn and learn and accrete more and more knowledge through examples. I think what's been wonderful about the Commission has been that it hasn't been a group of wonderful, though they may be, academics sitting in probably London, deciding what's the best thing to do and just proceeding with making a string of recommendations. It's actually involved not even just, I mean, sending out the questionnaire is important, but actually going out and talking to people and listening to them and going and doing it in different places. Because what might work quite well in London is going to be very different in Cardiff, is going to be very different in Glasgow, it's going to be very different wherever. So I think it's absolutely invaluable to go out, learn what works, and then crystallize that perhaps into something that could be disseminated across the country. You can find things that obviously would disseminate well. You can find other things that would work well, but with this ifs and buts, you'd have to have different context. You have to do other things first in different parts of the country. And then, being honest, there are some local initiatives which probably only work well in that area for particular reasons, historical reasons, accidental reasons. But you need to be constantly on the lookout, to learn and listen. That would be the sort of generic lesson I'd pick up. I mean, there are loads and loads of specific examples that the lovely women earlier were talking about from their different nations. And it's wonderful to see all that collected together.
Absolutely. So there is an organizing element as much as it important to the analysis. So here's another one. There's a lot of recommendations, but Sarah, would you be willing to maybe mention one recommendation that you would like to see or start upon for this year?
Well, that's incredibly difficult. In a sense, there are a set of recommendations, and
Yes.
most of them are sort of dependent on the other ones as a package to work. But I suppose, I mean, to me, the sort of fundamentals are the underpinnings of our economy, which are the way in which finance is described, money is accumulated, tax systems operate. It's so fundamental that until you do go in for a wholesale restructuring and you accept that the whole concept of a caring economy, not a productive economy, and you stop perhaps talking about gross domestic product in the way that we do, and you start talking about well-being and the way people experiencing their lives, all the other stuff is instrumental to doing that. But those other things individually they might shove things along a bit, but they won't on their own make the necessary difference, if you see what I'm saying. So we really do need a radical transformation. And going about that, I mean, somebody was saying as well, this government simply isn't listening to us. And I'm not surprised because I won't start. I do hope, and I do know that there have been discussions with the opposition parties, and I hope that continues, certainly, and also the national government in Scotland, it's the SNP, and other parties in Wales and in England and Northern Ireland. We do need to engage politically, but I wonder, the great achievement would be to get all of them to accept that you need to transform the economy, the UK economy and the national economies. Because otherwise, you're always stuck with the measurement being how much you're producing, the GDP, high finance. I don't know. And then just on a personal level, I've always been I'm so frustrated and angry about the taxation system. It is so unfair. And the local tax system as well. It doesn't take any real account of people who have vast amounts of accumulated wealth, which they don't share, people who manage to pay accountants to get them out of paying any tax. We all know the big companies that avoid paying tax. There's so much corruption, even of the current system, that needs to be addressed. So I've now more or less read out all the recommendations, told you which ones. Some people are going to come back and say, no, it's education. And others will say, no, it's work. But,
right.
There we are.
Right. But there is a reason to the package, as you called it, right? That it's not there's not a silver bullet, but to actually craft a package, because the key word here is transformation. It's a social transformation that you're seeking with a very, very compelling vision. A vision for a caring economy, a well-being economy. And, one of our participants here was actually asking, how do you communicate? In terms of communicating gender equal economy, what would you be the best way to communicate with communities on this notion or the idea of the larger project, as it were?
I suppose you had to drill down with people. I suppose here you might get groups in, community groups in to discuss what they care about in life. And what I always found fascinating is if you go out and talk to groups of people, actually, I mean, they will quite readily identify the importance of having paid work and this, that, and the other, and a decent house and so on. But actually, if you ask them about values, what really, really matters, you quite quickly get into the caring economy. People really, really care about their families, about their friends, about their environment. people are very quick to be angry about wanton destruction of the environment, and most people are, and people get furious about things like littering up the local park. And people will expend more emotional energy and intellectual energy in addressing what you do about that, their immediate environment, than they will actually about fretting about the sort of big issues that politicians keep going on about. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why people seem to be increasingly disengaging from political discourse, certainly at a national level, and that you find out, certainly actually inside London and the big cities as well, but perhaps more so outside, that you get independent people who aren't part of any political party who get elected to a council because they're passionate about libraries or something, you know, and that's their issue. And they gather a big sort of, you know, body of support behind them, and they go and they work on that and they achieve that. And I think that's really interesting, that people actually, their experience of life is often micro, but is often very personal. It's about caring and the caring experience. And people during the pandemic, one of the biggest surges of sort of national feeling was huge admiration and support, not just obviously for the health service staff, but the caring staff in care homes and people who worked in shops, and the horror actually at the low wages and the systemic abuse that exists actually from members of the public often towards people who work in care homes. Absolute previous undervaluing of people doing all those jobs that suddenly became infinitely more important than, I hope there are no plumbers here, people who tend to be very well paid in society, like plumbers and people who mend cars. It's a topsy-turvy world, isn't it, where people who mend cars and do things like that are valued in terms of how much they're paid much more highly than people who look after children, who are the future of the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I think I was reading in the papers that people were shocked that the pay of these care workers was actually that low. I mean, I think people had some sense of how low it was, but that low was just something that woke them up and even got them to just at least applaud and appreciate. But now I think the fight is on the ground to actually see living wages for these workers. So here's another challenge. I think that one of our participants is asking about, you know, what about all the talk from various governments on incorporating human rights into their policies? I mean, how do we ensure that they don't forget that about intersectional gender equality, and that is as important, if not, you know, integral to achieving or fulfilling these rights obligations?
Well, absolutely, and I only touched on it very briefly, but that doesn't mean it's not hugely important to remember that everyone is more than one characteristic. You know, I'm an old white woman. Other people might be a disabled man. You might be a gay black woman. People have a whole range of characteristics, and you live in your set of characteristics. So we have to be very mindful all the time of the intersect between the characteristics. I remember in my TUC days, attempts to amend the very clunky law on equalities, and any law on things like equalities is going to be clunky because it's quite hard to codify people's experiences. But it was very difficult to take a claim to the court, the employment tribunal. If your boss had just been pretty horrible to you and had been abusive, you had to decide whether it was abuse on grounds of sex, whether it was abuse on grounds of race, whether it was abuse on grounds of disability. And if you're subjected to a constant torrent of abuse, it's quite difficult to pick out which is which, especially if you're not, I'm afraid, if you're not unionised and you don't have professional advice. So your hopes of getting to a tribunal, well, at all actually, but even if you do get to one, and picking the right thing to complain about to get redress is quite slim actually. We did make attempts back in the day when we had a more friendly government to try and construct ways of the law intersecting properly. So you'd be able to take claims of dual, triple, quadruple discrimination in one go. But that was unpicked, I'm afraid, again, disgracefully by the coalition government. But I think intersect is absolutely critical, and that's something we said. Human rights, well, the first thing I'd say on that is we have to campaign to make sure this government doesn't start picking the Human Rights Act apart, because they're threatening to do that. They're threatening to water down the possibility of judicially reviewing a government or anyone else, a public body or anyone else for that matter, and they're threatening to water down the Human Rights Act. Either of those things would be absolutely appalling for the more vulnerable sections of our community. And again, Equally Ours, the charity that I'm currently chair of, we've tried to do a lot of work about communicating human rights. So a lot of people don't actually realise that they do have human rights now, and that they can make complaints legally in conjunction with other complaints if the basic human rights protections that they're covered by are being breached. And people don't realise that, and they have far more opportunity than they realise to do something under the Human Rights Act to rectify the situation. But if the Human Rights Act, now that we're out of the EU, is going to be watered right down to meaningless nothings, I'm afraid we've lost, we're not watching something slip through our hands that we'll very much notice after it's gone. So I really would urge everyone, whatever your political views, to campaign hard once the government really does start to take the Human Rights Act apart. They haven't started yet, but they keep saying they're going to, and they're certainly getting a lot of pressure from their own backbenchers, complete with tabloid newspaper headings about, awful, dreadful ways of caricaturing human rights and talking about wokeness. I mean, who ever thought of that awful phrase? So it's a big battle, and I fear in all this work we've done on the Commission that we wanted to move forwards, but actually in some ways at the moment we're also having to work really hard just to shore up what we've got at the moment, the good bits that there are. And that's the slightly worrying thing about where we are today. But we do have to protect these. We have to protect human rights, and we have to make sure as far as possible that when governments develop policies, they think about the intersect issues absolutely critically.
Absolutely.
That probably didn't answer the question.
No. I was going to say how important also the work that the Women's Budget Group had pulled together alongside Runnymede Trust, when they actually demonstrated how all the different identities, shall we say, are feeling the 10 years of austerity measures, and that in itself was quite, to me, very, very important, and perhaps even one of the more pioneering studies that out there on precisely on this question right now, right? So absolutely hear you on that.
The Women's Budget Group should be a nationally protected species. It's absolutely brilliant.
I will be the first person to campaign for that.
Absolutely, it's brilliant. And at the TUC, we used to rely really heavily on the Women's Budget Group, and I don't need to advertise it here, but I do advertise it wherever I go because it is absolutely superb, and we have to have it. Sorry, just got that quick plug in.
Plug away, yes. One of the groups that we haven't actually talked about is the private sector. How do you think we can get them on board with this vision? What do you think we can do?
That's always been a really tricky question to answer. I mean, you can get at them through the purse strings, as it were. Some big companies will suddenly start to do something that's actually quite caring, not because they really care, but because they sense that not caring is going to affect their customer base. So that's a cynical approach. So you can get, I don't know, Starbucks, Costa Coffee to start introducing recyclable cups, not because they think it's a good idea or important. They don't like it at all because it costs them money. But they've realised that there's a growing feeling, particularly amongst the demographic that uses takeaway cups of coffee a lot, that doing this is becoming necessary, and that consumers, given a choice, will go and use the outlet that does provide the sustainable growth, recyclable cups. So there's always been that. I think people underestimate the power actually of consumer pressure on companies, but then there are the companies that are much more difficult to get at, the finance companies and the others that operate almost sub-radar. And in some ways, I think all you can do with them is tough regulation. And I think one of the worst things that's happened recently is taking the brake off and letting some of those deregulatory instincts take over and watering down the enforcement mechanisms, the number of staff you had in HMRC and so on, so that it's much more of a free-for-all now again in the financial sector, and that's awful. So I think you need a combination, I think, of people pressure through trade unions as well. That's very important, where they're recognised, they have huge influence on the companies they're in, absolutely. Through consumer pressure, but also through, you do need tough regulation. I'm not one of these people who says, we don't need all this burdensome red tape at all. Quite the opposite. You do need tough, enforceable, accessible regulation, and that for the finance sector is absolutely critical.
Critical for the financial sector, and absolutely with you on union organizing. One of the people the organization Global Union, it's a global union federation, and one of their campaigns is actually to look at equity investors, those who own shares of long-term care homes, let's say, or those who own shares of nursing homes, and they are looking at environmental, social, and governance type of investment, and holding them to account, after making such commitments. So indeed, there are avenues that we need to continue to explore, but there's nothing like union organizing, in my view. And Sarah,
I agree with you. I agree with you 100% on that.
Yes. So, I'm going to take one more question before Marianne comes on board to close us out. There's one here that's I think it's interesting for us to think about. So it says here, given the distinction you've made between well-being and caring economy, what do you think are the implications of this distinction for gender budgeting as a possible way for transitioning into well-being budgets in the same way that New Zealand is looking at it right now?
Well, I think the obvious quick answer is to look at how New Zealand's doing it, because they're a fantastic example. Actually, Wales as well. I was incredibly encouraged when I was doing the commission there on Fair Work, how much was being done on future generations and on, this isn't quite answering your question because I'm not entirely sure what the technical answer to that is, not being an economist myself, but there is a distinction between well-being and caring. But I think look at examples of where it's happening. That's probably the best thing to do, because you can sit around with a pencil and a piece of paper or a computer and think of theoretically how it should be done. But actually, if people have already started out doing it, especially from the bottom up, I think the model will start to emerge. I'm not sure there is at the moment a template for this, and it would depend on the way the economy is organised in each country. But I still go back to let's go back down and see what's happening on the ground and see if we can, between us, assemble something that would achieve both those aims and put the two things together. Because to me, they're not synonymous, but they probably ought to be. I mean, well-being and a caring economy is, it's the same thing. You want well-being to be the underpinning theme, and you want caring to be the mechanism by which that is achieved. I think Marianne and others from the Women's Budget Group will be able to put that in a far more articulate and better way. So I completely
did it well.
But New Zealand, I think New Zealand is, Jacinda Ardern is brilliant. And I'll tell you one tiny quick story. May I tell you one tiny story?
Please.
This is true. It's a TC story. We had a job in my old department, the women's officer job, which is a lovely job. We had lots of brilliant applicants. And one of those was someone called Jacinda Ardern. And I knew her a bit. She worked in Tony Blair's office for a while. Then she worked in a thing called the Better Regulation Executive. She was from New Zealand, of course, but was working in the UK. So she applied for this job and I interviewed her and I was overwhelmed by her. She was absolutely wonderful. And the other candidates were very good too. So I had to think very carefully about all this. Anyway, I rang her up and said, we're minded to offer you the job. The only thing that slightly holds me back is this is a permanent job. And I'm not sure what your intentions are in terms of staying in the UK. And she was delightfully, wonderfully honest. And she said, I'd love to work for you, but I could only do it for a year. And I was then under instructions from our General Secretary that we were not going to take someone on for 1 year and then go through another. So I took someone else on who proved to be absolutely 100% brilliant. But it was just, I dine out on that one. I met her, we talked, I met her a couple of times. She is lovely. She's a wonderful woman. And if every country could be run by her, the world would be a much better place. And I think that's a nice place to end. A wonderful woman.
And a great story, Sarah. It's brilliant. Yes. And we have Marianne here now to take us home. Marianne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Marina and Sarah, for an absolutely fabulous discussion. It was really, really good. And, even though I was very closely involved in the commission and, went to most of the meetings and know this story, it's still, you know, whenever I hear you talk about it, Sarah, and actually indeed all the feel it kind of gets fresh life, and there's new things that I hadn't thought about, and it's great. So I do urge everyone to read the report of the Commission, because it was a really, really brilliant piece of work that they came up with. So we've come to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank all the speakers on both our panels, which have been really, really good. It's been a fabulous afternoon. We're going to be moving. We're not going to just kick you out like normally happens with a Zoom meeting. We're actually going to be moving into conversation mode again for another half an hour. So you will eventually get kicked out, but there is half an hour where if you want to chat to any of the other participants or talk about any of the things that you've heard today, you'll have that opportunity. We're trying to, you know, we wanted to have a real world event. We wanted to be able to bring people together, and we can't. So we're trying to get as close to that as possible. So if you can stay, please do so. I very much hope you'll all join us for tomorrow. As I said, what we're going to be doing tomorrow in the morning is to try as closely as possible to replicate a sort of open space event where people can actually go to different, you know, to go to different tables to talk to people about the issues that they're interested in. So I will explain how that's going to work tomorrow morning. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you all about it now. But so that's how the morning's going to start. And then the final session in the afternoon is towards a green and caring economy. And so we're going to be thinking both about some of the messages from the Commission, but specifically some of the things taking forward from our feminist Green New Deal project, which is looking not just about the environment in the context of the wider context of women's lives, of which care is central. So thank you all very much. Thank you to Marina and Sarah for the brilliant last panel, and particular thanks to Anna and Hannah, who've done all the organising for the event, because I know these events are always a nightmare to organise and there's lots of running around. It's gone brilliantly. I told you it would go brilliantly. It has gone brilliantly. Thank you very much for all your hard work. I think you can move us into conversation mode now if you want.